In the pre-dawn chill of late May, a small convoy of fisheries research vessels slipped out past the breakwaters into the open swell. On board were thousands of juvenile apex predators, swimming in aeration tanks beneath canvas tarpaulins. There were no press releases, no broadcast cameras, and no government ministers cutting ribbons. The marine biologists running the operation kept it quiet because they were executing a move many in conventional fisheries management viewed as pure madness. When the monitoring data finally came back years later, the team stayed silent even longer. What those animals were doing to the seabed defied every ecological baseline on the books. To understand why this covert release took place, you have to rewind a century to a time when our coastal river mouths and bays were fundamentally different places. Out on the water, a solitary commercial netter hauled up a leviathan from the brackish depths, an archaic creature covered in heavy armor, having no clue he was holding the last of a vanishing dynasty. This was the Atlantic sturgeon, though calling it a simple fish fails to capture what it truly is. A fully grown adult could measure 3.5 meters in length and tip the scales at well over 300 kilograms, the bulk of a steel-bodied farm ute sliding silently across the marine floor. Its anatomical blueprint has survived unchanged for nearly 200 million years. Instead of ordinary scales, its flanks are shielded by 5 longitudinal rows of thick, bony plates, known as scutes, an evolutionary armor developed before eucalyptus forests or flowering plants ever appeared on Earth. It is a genuine relic from deep geological time, having weathered mass extinctions and continental drift without altering its fundamental design. Yet every evolutionary advantage that guaranteed its survival across hundreds of millennia abruptly became a fatal trap in the modern era. The creature is anadromous. It feeds and grows in the open sea, but when breeding time arrives, instinct compels it to navigate hundreds of kilometers upstream into inland river systems, seeking out the exact gravel beds where it first hatched. When coastal development surged, engineering authorities stepped in. Rivers were choked with concrete barrages, irrigation weirs, and hydro dams. Adult sturgeon returned from the ocean ready to spawn, only to slam into towering concrete spillways where clear, oxygenated gravel once lay. Unable to ascend, they drifted at the base of the walls, waiting for waterways that would never open again, perishing without casting a single fertile egg. Upstream blockades were only half the crisis. In offshore waters, commercial bottom trawlers raked the benthic sediment bare, destroying the worm and shellfish beds the species relied on. Compounding this, females require over a decade of slow growth before reaching breeding maturity. A creature moving at that evolutionary tempo simply cannot survive modern mechanized harvesting. By the mid-1980s, the entire regional population had been completely wiped out. In less than a century, 80 million years of biological permanence had been reduced to zero. When an apex aquatic species vanishes from the map, the fallout rarely stays confined to a single line item in a government-threatened species registry. It triggers a slow, insidious unraveling of the entire catchment. By the late 1980s, the species was officially declared biologically extinct across the entire sea basin. The vast historical schools that once numbered in the millions, running up from coastal estuaries into inland headwaters, had been erased down to the absolute bone. Globally, the only known self-sustaining remnant clung to survival thousands of kilometers away in a single French river basin, numbering barely a few hundred weary survivors. Back in our waters, the sudden absence of this colossal bottom feeder left a massive void in the ecological machinery. The muddy seafloor, once constantly turned over and aerated, began to calcify into a suffocating, static trap. Runoff from sprawling agriculture and intensive rural land clearing washed unchecked down the rivers during seasonal downpours, pouring tons of synthetic fertilizers and livestock waste straight out to sea. Without the giant bottom dwellers continuously disturbing the sediment and cycling nutrients, that chemical cocktail settled deep into the silt, festering under the relentless midday sun. When summer hit with scorching heat waves, The inland estuaries and coastal shallows turned into stagnant incubators. The built-up phosphorus and nitrogen fermented on the seabed, triggering catastrophic toxic algal blooms that coated the bays in thick, foul green scum for hundreds of square kilometers. Surface waters choked. Sunlight couldn't penetrate the gloom. Underwater seagrass beds collapsed, and schools of commercial fish died in droves from sudden oxygen depletion. The marine floor had essentially become a dead zone, an anoxic desert of foul, rotting muck where almost nothing complex could survive. For decades, statutory catchment management boards and state environmental authorities tried to tackle the degradation through conventional bureaucratic levers. They enforced strict seasonal catch quotas, slapped hefty licensing conditions on commercial trawlers, and declared sweeping marine parks. Yet year after year, the seabed continued to rot. Regulators were attempting to treat the symptoms of a dying waterway without addressing the missing mechanical engine that once kept it alive. It was right at this low point that a rogue syndicate of field biologists made a proposition that their peers dismissed as outright fantasy. They argued that saving the dying coastal basin didn't require more administrative red tape or artificial chemical treatments. It required reintroducing the very ancient predator that humanity had wiped out. To conventional fisheries managers, dumping a prehistoric bottom feeder into a biologically degraded sea sounded like throwing taxpayer funds into a bottomless trench. But to the researchers, leaving the basin to die wasn't an option. The hard work of undoing an extinction had to begin. The scientific community called it a fool's errand. Reintroducing a massive apex feeder into a collapsed marine basin flew in the face of standard conservation doctrine. There were no commercial grants, virtually zero appetite among state fisheries boards, and substantial legal hurdles. But the small scientific outfit had one unassailable premise driving them. Human engineering had caused the extinction, so human ingenuity was duty-bound to attempt the rebuild. Yet the operational hurdles were staggering. You cannot simply grab any random strain of sturgeon from an international breeding facility and dump it into open coastal channels. Over countless millennia of geographic isolation, our local population had adapted its physiology to distinct salinity gradients, seasonal water temperatures, and specific estuary dynamics. Dropping in a foreign genetic strain from Western Europe would constitute biological contamination rather than genuine ecological restoration. What followed was a painstaking forensic search. For 3 long years, researchers scoured public aquariums, private collections, and institutional research tanks across the continent, hunting for surviving individuals that carried the precise ancestral genetic markers. After thousands of DNA assays, they found just 6 pure specimens. 6 living animals, scattered across an entire continent, formed the fragile genetic bottleneck from which an entire population had to be resurrected. The biological realities made the project even tougher. Releasing vulnerable fingerlings straight into the wild was useless. Predatory flathead, snook, and seabirds would annihilate them within hours. Every juvenile had to be carefully head-started in closed aquaculture tanks for nearly a year until its heavy bony scutes hardened into functional body armor. The sheer financial and logistical burden threatened to stall the entire effort. Recognizing they couldn't pull this off in isolation, the team formed a quiet transnational consortium with partner hatcheries across neighboring borders. Together, they constructed dedicated breeding facilities and established an intensive aquaculture pipeline. By late autumn in 2005, the facilities produced their inaugural cohort, roughly 7,200 robust young fish. To maintain total operational control, each juvenile was fitted with a miniature tracking microchip behind its dorsal fin, while distinct trailing notches were clipped into their tail fins, a permanent identification code for every annual release. Biologists calculated that establishing a resilient, self-sustaining wild stock would require releasing upwards of 500,000 animals over a 15-year timeframe. Without that critical mass, inbreeding depression would collapse the bloodline. On the 23rd of May, The first batch was quietly tipped into the riverbanks, vanishing beneath the brackish tide into the vast, unforgiving expanse. Out on the water, the reality of wildlife management is unsentimental and rough. Commercial netters and trawler skippers who make their living working the coastal grounds have little patience for academic experiments, especially when those experiments threaten to foul up their gear. Within 2 seasons of the initial releases, the restoration project slammed into a brutal operational wall that nobody in the laboratory had properly planned for. Professional crews working the outer shoals and tidal channels began hauling up sturgeon tangled tight in their commercial mesh nets, alongside their regular catches of sea salmon and coastal finfish. At first glance, field observers thought the reports proved the stocked animals were thriving. But when fisheries inspectors pulled the electronic chips and checked the fin notches, the data revealed a grim reality. Almost every single snagged carcass was a juvenile released just 2 or 3 years prior. Immature animals, years away from their first breeding run, were being choked out in monofilament mesh before they ever had a chance to drop a single egg. The entire multi-million-dollar breeding pipeline was leaking straight through commercial nets. If this bycatch rate continued, the species would simply bleed out in the shallows long before a wild generation could ever take root. The institutional response was swift, heavy-handed, and uncompromising. Fisheries authorities and regional environmental regulators brought the hammer down, enacting a blanket prohibition on retaining sturgeon, backed by eye-watering fines of up to $25,000 per animal. Neighboring maritime jurisdictions were forced to align, effectively turning hundreds of kilometers of coastal waterways into an enforceable, zero-take sanctuary for a single prehistoric fish. The backlash from commercial fishing ports was immediate and fierce. Skippers and regional fishing co-ops railed against the severe penalties, protesting that unworkable green tape was choking their livelihoods to protect an animal most people considered long gone anyway. Skeptics within government agencies openly questioned whether taxpayers were pouring public funds into a bottomless biological sinkhole. Yet, amid the fierce pushback, the hatcheries kept their pumps running round the clock. Year after year, specialized transport trailers rolled down coastal slipways, steadily releasing tagged cohorts into the tide. By 2018, the cumulative tally across the network surged past 400,000 released fish. Yet despite the sheer volume, the central question remained unanswered. Were these hatchery-reared stocks merely surviving on life support? Or could they ever break the cycle of captivity and reclaim their ancestral role in the wild? Then, without warning, a single fish hauled up near an offshore island rewrote the entire narrative. A commercial crew pulled aboard an unblemished specimen measuring well over 1.5 meters. When fisheries officers ran the scanner across its flank, there was no microchip. They checked the tail fin. No notches, no scarring, no tags. Laboratory genetic analysis confirmed it carried the pristine ancestral markers, yet matched not a single batch released from the aquaculture stations. There was only one biological explanation. This fish was born entirely in the wild. For the first time in well over half a century, mature adults had located each other in the turbid river currents and spawned without human intervention. Field research teams immediately deployed underwater survey craft into the historical spawning grounds, where cameras captured stunning confirmation. Vast stretches of ancient river gravel had been swept clean of choking silt, revealing active spawning nests only weeks old. Yet the return of the fish was overshadowed by the profound ecological cascade it triggered across the marine floor. What managers had failed to understand was that the sturgeon is a master ecological engineer. When foraging along the benthic zone, it does not merely hunt. It functions like a heavy mechanical plow. Thrusting its armored snout deep into the substrate, it systematically churns over the compacted mud, injecting vital oxygen into layers that had sat suffocating and anoxic for generations. Benthic surveys revealed an immediate paradox. Where sturgeon fed heavily, wild shellfish beds, worms, and native bivalves increased by nearly 35% within a decade. By constantly tilling the sediment, The giants created the ideal aerated nursery conditions their prey required to flourish. In the highest density feeding zones, total benthic biomass surged by 40% in just 5 years. The water column cleared dramatically as suspended particles settled, allowing sunlight to penetrate deep into the shallows, stimulating vast underwater meadows of native sea vegetation. Then came the definitive oceanic data that astonished marine scientists. In regions heavily reworked by the sturgeon, dissolved phosphorus levels in the bottom water dropped by almost 20%. By aerating the benthic layers, the feeding fish exposed buried organic matter to oxygen-rich currents, enabling beneficial marine microbes to lock up excess nutrients instead of allowing them to fuel toxic summer algal blooms. Furthermore, native river lampreys and other threatened bottom dwellers, which required pristine gravel beds to reproduce, began staging dramatic recoveries alongside them. Even the commercial skippers who had initially fought the zero-take restrictions found their nets swelling with commercial finfish, rapidly converting the fiercest local skeptics into outspoken advocates for expanded habitat sanctuaries. By the early 2020s, the offshore monitoring network had evolved into a sophisticated technological grid. High-tech acoustic hydrophones and benthic motion arrays were deployed across critical seabed sectors, initially configured to detect illegal poachers targeting the fish for valuable roe. But late one autumn, the automated arrays began flashing unprecedented data. Deep in the open bay, the sensors picked up dozens of colossal acoustic signatures, clustered tightly over a rocky reef system 12 meters below the surface. Field teams dispatched commercial divers, expecting a technical malfunction. Instead, their camera feeds revealed an extraordinary spectacle. More than 100 fully grown sturgeon massed over marine gravel, rolling and brushing against one another in a frantic spawning ritual. It was the first documented mass aggregation of wild sturgeon in more than 70 years. Even more startling was the location. This wild gathering was taking place 20 kilometers out in the open, high salinity sea, defying every established biological textbook that insisted these creatures could only reproduce in freshwater gravel beds. Whether the animals had rapidly adapted a new survival strategy or simply reactivated an ancient evolutionary mechanism dormant for centuries, the implication was clear. The species was rewriting its own survival playbook. Genetic assays showed that over half the individuals possessed no hatchery tags at all, exhibiting broader genetic diversity than the initial breeding stock. Population modelers recalculating the data discovered the wild population would reach self-sustaining stability decades ahead of original scientific forecasts. By 2024, the state hatcheries took a landmark step. They intentionally reduced planned stocking quotas. The wild stock had grown robust enough that introducing additional farm-reared fish was no longer necessary. The human crutch could finally be kicked away. This bold intervention was never just about saving a single relic of prehistory. It was about returning the essential mechanical gear that an entire marine ecosystem needed to rebuild itself from the bottom up. Today, the ancient Leviathan is no longer slipping quietly into extinction. The hardest battle was never the tight aquaculture budgets or the initial regulatory skepticism. It was convincing people that natural systems possess an extraordinary capacity to repair themselves once the underlying ecological engines are restored. Right now, 12 meters beneath the coastal swell, an armored giant born entirely in the open wild patrols the gravel in the dark. It is the living proof of what happens when we give natural resilience a fighting chance. If this profound ecological resurrection changed how you look at the hidden machinery of our waterways, follow along, because uncovering these remarkable transformations across our wild landscapes is what we do every single week.